Hail and welcome to Witching Out Loud, the podcast where we celebrate the art of witchcraft and conjuring magic in your daily life. Join us for a cozy chat about witchy ways and practical woo-woo.
I'm Crystal with Unveil, necromancer, spiritual trainer, and mentor.
And I'm Kate, priestess for hire and an intuitive tarot reader.
Icy Sedgwick hails from the frozen north of England. She writes Gothic-tinged fantasy novels and Gothic short stories. When she's not writing fiction, she's blogging about folklore, legends, and the supernatural. Icy runs the fabulous Folklore podcast to accompany her blog, bringing you slices of fab folklore in 15 minutes or less. And I found this fantastic poem that went along with one of the books I read of Icy's preparing for this podcast. It's called The Necromancer's Apprentice by Bass Monkey. Indentured to the necromancer at the age of 12, I did a lot of laundry, didn't do much raising hell. If I slacked off, I was beaten. I got used to being hit. I cleaned a lot of chamber pots and took a lot of shit. But I watched the necromancer raising bodies from their graves, enchanting them with incantations, making them his slaves. That's hella cool, I thought. I gotta get me some of that. As I scrubbed the kitchen floor and shook the dust out of the mat. Assistant to the necromancer when I turned 18, undoubtedly the happiest that I had ever been. I labored in the library to teach myself the art, scouring all the grimoires for the magic they'd impart. I assisted him in rituals and rolled his cigarettes, procured his whores and alcohol, and paid his gambling debts. I kissed the necromancer's daughter underneath the stairs. He disapproved, so we made sure to keep him unawares. Then I became the necromancer, aged just 25, promoted when my predecessor ceased to be alive. The doctor said that poison berries robbed him of his life. His daughter, Martha, mourned him, but agreed to be my wife. And as the necromancer, I was feared throughout the land. The old man couldn't beat me now for holding Martha's hand. Occasionally, I brought him back to see his former world, but his face would always blacken when he caught sight of his girl. Enslaved now by the necromancer, age has little worth. 27 years have passed since my date of birth. I never saw it coming when she stabbed me in the back. She plunged the dagger into me and everything went black. The latest necromancer summoned me back from the dead. It wasn't hard disposing of the pair of you, she said. I'm back off to my grave now, so I'll leave you with my tale, which goes to show the female is more deadly than the male. Hail and welcome to Witching Out Loud.
That was absolutely awesome. I love that.
As soon as I read that, I'm like, it's almost like you wrote it.
I wish.
I'm like, yes, this has to be shared with the world. I love it so much. As a necromancer myself, it was perfect. Well, welcome to Witching Out Loud, Icy. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
It's always really difficult to know what to say at this particular point, but I think as anyone can gather by my accent, I'm from the north of England and I blog about folklore, I podcast about folklore, and I do often take tangents off into the occult and anything that's weird, unusual, or just a bit odd. That's all in my wheelhouse. And yeah, I write gothic fiction, although to be honest with you, the folklore stuff kind of overtook that. So yeah, as long as I'm writing or I've got my nose in a book, I'm quite happy, really.
Fantastic. Me too. When I was researching your books, I was like, wait, she has fiction books out here too, not just the folklore. And I was digging into all the folklore, but then I had to stop and go read The Necromancer's Apprentice. So it was fantastic.
I think you're the first podcast host that's done that. So I was quite pleased. I was like, oh my God, you read it.
I loved it. It was fantastic.
I've got a lot of love for my necromancer.
Yeah. And well, as soon as I saw that, I'm like, well, as a necromancer, I have to go read this. How did I not know this existed? That's just like lazy on my part. Well, we love to talk about what brought you to your magical path. And so what brought you to being witch, pagan, however you define yourself?
It's a funny one. I think probably as a teenager, it would have. That's where we're obviously going to end up going. Let's be honest. And I think it was the typical sort of thing where you're about 16 and you're like, "Oh, I haven't got any control over what's going on around me right now." And then you sort of, I think there was a documentary about witchcraft on telly, and I was like, "I want me some of that." And I started reading all the 90s sort of like Wicca 101 books and things like that. And they never really 100% sat right with me for various reasons. But I just kind of really loved mythology from when I was about 8. So you kind of layered mythology and magic and witchcraft and everything on top of each other. And then when I got older, I was kind of like, oh, wow, there's so much more to this than those like velvet coated books that you could buy where they were like spell books, you know which ones I mean. There's so much more to this than they ever promised that there might be. So yeah, I think it was just kind of your typical teenage angst that then turned into like almost a career. So that was cool.
That is fantastic. How old were you when you wrote your first book?
Ooh, when I wrote my first fiction, I would have been 28, and it was a Western, so completely different.
We all start somewhere.
Exactly.
What draws you to folklore as the foundation of your writings?
I think it's something that I'd been interested in since I was about 10. Through sort of ghost stories were like the gateway into it all. And where I am, our region's like just steeped in legends. So we've got dragons, we've got vampires, believe it or not, we've got fairies, we've got more ghosts than you can shake a stick at. And I think I just actually weirdly not realizing what it was, but it was a really good way to connect with a sense of place. And from there I started, whenever I go anywhere, I read the folk tales and the legends of where I'm going, and I feel like you get a better insight into where you are. And also it's quite nice when you read them from other cultures, because then you get a lovely insight into other people's values and things like that. I think it's ultimately, there's lots of discussions about like what is folklore, and a lot of them get quite academic, and in a lot of ways I'm like, it's a study of people really, but it's a study of people through stories rather than anything else, and I really like that. And then when Folklore Thursday became really popular, well, actually it was the second week it was running, thinking about it on Twitter back in 2015. And I'm like, oh, that was only a couple of years ago. And then you're like, no, it wasn't. That was over a decade ago. And then I thought, I was like, oh, wow, okay, other people are into this as well. Awesome. And I just started blogging about it for that. And then discovered that there was this whole community of people who also liked that kind of thing, and weird stories and ghosts and legends and things as well. So it's been really interesting seeing the resurgence of it over the last sort of 5 years or so, as more and more people are like, oh, I like that, and I didn't realize it had a name. And it's really cool to realize that actually a lot of people to some degree have an interest in it. So it's a nice icebreaker when you have to talk to people, better than like, what do you do for a living? What's your favorite childhood myth? Much more enlightening.
Ooh, that is a much better icebreaker. You know, I came to witchcraft through mythology and folklore as well, because back then I'm 54. So back when I was 13, like we didn't have all those books, and I lived in a small town. So all I had was like the little small town library. I didn't even have a Barnes and Noble. It didn't exist. So it was mythology and folklore that really gave me that love of magic as well. So I definitely connected with your work as flipping through it. What is in all of your research and looking at different folklore, like what's a piece of folklore that you think more people should know about?
Oh, I've got a few, but I think it's not really necessarily folklore per se. I think it's just good practice, particularly if you're in a country that has a lot of folk tales about not annoying fairies. Please take your letter home with you. They don't want that. And I just kind of feel like there's a lot of things like that, like how to actually be in the world without annoying your neighbours, as it were, I think is quite useful. And like we have a real, I don't know if this is a problem in America, but we have a real problem in the UK of people doing things like picking up dog poo in a dog poo bag and then hanging it from a tree. What kind of weird deity do you think you're going to summon with an offering like that? Like, please just put it in the bin. Yeah, so it's more a kind of a question, I think, of using folklore as a means to kind of just better interact with your environment. And yeah, throw your dog poo out, man.
Yeah, I think the fairies need to carry off more people, so that there's a more healthy fear of leaving dog poop in the tree. I love that. Well, what are you creating now that is kind of lighting up your fire? Are you working on a book or researching some new folklore?
Yeah, at the moment I'm actually doing a series looking at sort of herbalists and how that contributes to plant lore. Because I was sitting there going, is herbalism and plant lore, are they bedfellows? And they are, because obviously when you look at a lot of plant lore, there is actually so much stuff where like there is actually something about the traditional use of this plant in the stories about it. Sometimes not. It depends on the story and whether Pliny the Elder collected it, really. But a lot of the time, you can see where the folklore builds on the actual use of the plant. So I thought, yes, I'll do herbalist. But I'm specifically looking at herbalists who then created their own herbals, and just seeing the development of botanical illustration, if nothing else, has been really interesting. And it gives us an excuse to look at old books on Internet Archive. So clearly I'm going to be happy with that, because my God, if we'd had Internet Archive years ago, that would have been a very different sort of scenario, I think. And then on top of that, I'm researching a book where I'm looking at the folktales and legends of Northumberland and the Scottish borders, because centuries ago we were part of the same kingdom. So I'm looking at them to see what they can actually tell us about the history of the region that's still at the heart of the folktales. And for nothing else, it's a good excuse to go and revisit all of these really cool places, because you can't really move in this area without stumbling over an Iron Age fort or a bit of Hadrian's Wall or something like that. So it's a good excuse for lots of day trips and adventures, which is always nice.
Fantastic. Fun. As I'm getting ready to write my first book, I realize how much research is involved that I didn't realize. And I don't think a lot of people do realize how much research has to be involved in order, especially doing something like folklore, because there's so many conflicting. And one of the things that you said in your book that I loved was you have to also look at who wrote that account of it. Like, were they white Christian male and they were writing about Black deities? And what does that say? Like, how does that color it? How do you discern all of that as you're going through it, that research?
It's really funny, because I had this problem when I was doing the book Rebel Folklore, and obviously I was looking at folklore figures around the world, and the minute you get to Latin America, you sort of hit this wall where a lot of it was obviously written down by missionaries, and you're like, oh, that's going to be biased. But in some cases, there's a weird thing where if you actually sort of read between the lines almost, you can be like, hang on, they're preserving what they've heard precisely to critique it, but that means they're still preserving what they've heard. So if you strip away that layer of, dare I say, propaganda, you can then see what sort of sits underneath it. And while, yes, it would be brilliant to have this in sort of Indigenous voices, for example, and obviously that's definitely something that you find a lot more in recent sources. When you're looking at something from, centuries ago, you do have to look at it and go, this is going to be biased, isn't it? And sometimes you also get things that conflict just simply because it's being collected in two different areas. And then you sort of think, obviously, this region has this belief and this region might have the exact opposite. And I always like to think that's because someone went from one to the other. And there's always that one person who always misremembers everything that they're told. I always like to think that that's all that happened. But you can kind of have this both and mentality where you can go, well, it can be both this and that, rather than it needing to be either or. And I think you can then look at folklore from the point of view of what is it telling you about the person who collected it, the era in which it was collected, and why it was collected. So you get these like bonus side quests that, my God, the rabbit holes that they can lead to look at, as well as just what have they actually written down. And I think it's quite useful to then read around the history of when something was collected as well, because then you can obviously have a bit more insight into the degree to which a person might be biased. So you sometimes get this when countries are trying to create their own sense of national identity. Sometimes it can go a bit wrong. I'm thinking of the Brothers Grimm here. In their case, it went horribly wrong. But other times, you then have to sort of think, have they like zhuzhed up some of the stories that they've found? Or have they just simply made them, if they've heard a person in the street tell them a story, it might not be particularly cinematic. So have they then kind of given it the storytelling treatment, but in so doing, it's then not the original story, it's like a remix of it. So again, you just have to bear all of these things in mind, and all of the things then become valid at the same time, which can be a bit of a weird thing, because it's instinctively you want to pick the right one. There is no right one a lot of the time. So I think it's why it's so important for people to do collecting now. But of course, the different methods, obviously, where you can then record someone talking and preserve their words as they are for posterity, it is slightly different. It's more a matter of, oh my God, where do I store all this content becomes the issue. But I suppose if your biggest problem is file storage, then you're probably doing quite well, really.
Yeah, probably. That's fantastic. I really like the way you're thinking about it, of it's not a this and that, it's an and. It's like all of it's true, because we can't just go back and ask the original person. Unless we're the necromancer's apprentice, we're probably not bringing them back. Too bad. That would be fascinating. And I'm thinking from a witch's perspective, especially as a necromancer, I do work with spirits and bring spirits back to talk with them. Like, wow, I wonder, I hadn't thought about in my research for my own book, utilizing my witchcraft to then speak with the spirits of that actual folklore from, spirits that maybe might have been available at that time. Why don't I think of these things? It's fantastic.
It's a funny one because I know you sometimes get this, with like all those lists of correspondences that used to be in the witchy books and so on. Sometimes if you look at those from a folklore point of view, you can be like, that doesn't make any sense though, because that plant doesn't do that thing or whatever it might be. And sometimes it does make sense if you think like peppermint for abundance, because my God, does peppermint grow in abundance? Whether you want it to. I've got some apple mint that grows outside my back door, literally in a scrape of dirt. There's not even any actual, and it's thriving there, and I've no idea why, but it just turned up one day, so I left it. But you think, so for things like that, you can understand where that comes from. But then if you also look at the origin myth for where peppermint comes from, you're like, well, that doesn't actually make any sense. But now I understand why it would be used in things to do with the dead. So I think sometimes the folklore just gives you a wider span of stuff, and obviously you can talk to the plants themselves and ask what they want to be used or what they're like willing to be used in. But I think there is definitely a sense of folklore gives you a lot more options, so you can be a lot more flexible with what you've got available at any given time, rather than just what does the book say.
Yeah, I love that. So you brought me right around to my other question. Thank you very much. And that was on plants. I am currently studying to be an herbalist. And so I'm super fascinated by the idea of folklore. Some of it gets brought in as we're learning herbalism, just a little bit. But we do talk about like, how did this plant come to be, or how did it come to be in this region, and the energetics of the plant. But we don't necessarily talk about the folklore of the plant. And I think that's a really beautiful way to round it out and like fully understand what the plant does. What led you down that path to start investigating that?
It sounds quite trite to say this because obviously you kind of go, yeah, I'm a stereotypical goth, but it was poisonous plants. And I started reading about poisonous plants. Obviously, I'm not that far from the Anic Garden. So obviously I've been to the Poison Garden and done the tour, I don't know how many times. And I do think toxic plants, like super toxic plants, do have like a bit of an aura. And I remember once going into one of the hot houses at Kew, and it was all the carnivorous plants, and I walked in and just went nope, turned around and walked back out because it just felt weird in there. I was like, oh, not for me. Whereas obviously when I've looked at all these different poisonous ones, and then I was fascinated by them, but never really, thankfully, came into contact with a lot of them. Obviously some of them grow quite abundantly here. But it was actually during the pandemic, and when we had our first lockdown, it was like, oh, you're allowed 20 minutes of state-sanctioned exercise a day. So I would go for a walk around this little woodland area near my house, and I'd be like, oh, I don't know what that plant is. What are you? And I don't know what that tree is. What are you? And then I would sort of get to know them, and because I'd always loved trees, and I think trees are a bit easier sometimes when the leaves are out. Once the leaves are gone, it's like all bets are off as to whether I can identify them or not. But then it was like, well, I know that one's an oak tree because they're fairly iconic, and I know that one's a hawthorn because, again, they've got really recognisable leaves. And it was a way of kind of getting to know the neighbours, I guess, the community, and widening that out beyond just the people and animals who live here, and then looking at what do I actually have grown in my garden. And weirdly, ever since I started really paying attention, as plants just turn up in my garden now, it's absolutely hilarious. Like, I've got 3 fern patches now. They just rocked up one day and they were like, this is quite nice. Someone on the estate had Welsh poppies, and they just took root, and now they're all over the garden and next door and the house next to. I've got an agapanthus, and I mean, I think that came from my next door neighbour, but like his will not grow in a pot. And I've got them in the worst soil, and they're like, yeah, man, this is amazing. And they're thriving. And my neighbour's looking at them going, well, why are they growing for you and not me? And I'm like, I don't know. So I do think that, when you start getting to know plants and hanging out with them and getting to know sort of their own individual personalities and stuff, they do kind of show up in a different way. And I think that that's one of the things that the folklore sometimes kind of gives you. It is like that sense of personality to them. A little bit like I met a deadly nightshade at the Dilston Physic Garden. And that one had an aura. And it was like, oh, you really like attention, don't you? And I was just like, I'm just going to give you a wide berth, whereas something like the plum tree, for example, completely different vibe. So I think folklore was a nice kind of gateway into then getting to know these different trees and plants. And now I will, when I go traveling, I'll be like, is there a botanic garden there that I can go and visit? Because I just like going to see what other places have.
Yeah, I love that too. I love when you were talking about that you just have these volunteers. because the more I connect with plants, the more volunteers I get. And then I go out and sit with them. I'm like, well, what brought you to my yard? And what do you want to be made of? And that's really how I started down the herbalism path, is I started making them into the products or the tinctures or the medicine that they wanted to be and why they came to me. So I really love that. I have a nightshade that volunteered, and it's not deadly nightshade, but it is a black nightshade. And it volunteered first in my garden. So I sat with it like, what are you here for? It's like, oh, there's someone close to you that is harmful to you. They're toxic. And totally rooted that out, and the plant disappeared. And then I had a terrible neighbor move in, and boom, she started growing right over there. She's like, this person is not good for you. So wherever she pops out, I look in that direction. I'm like, who's over there?
Oh, I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah. So I love that. I can't wait for this book. That's right up my alley. I've never gotten into kind of the folklore of the plant. So now I'm curious to kind of go down that path and look at maybe my Black Nightshade's folklore. Queen Anne's lace showed up last year or the year before, when all of our rights started getting taken away here in the US. Queen Anne's lace showed up, which is not to be taken if you're trying to give birth. I asked her what she wanted to be. She's like, I just want you to spread these seeds around everywhere. Okay. Well, so you're working on that book. Let's talk about your book that just came out, Fate or Fortune, and share that with people. What prompted you to write Fate or Fortune?
I've been covering divination folklore for a while on the podcast, so I looked at things like reading tea leaves, and my God, there's a lot of folklore to do with tea. And I don't mean tea as a plant, but just drinking tea has tons of weird superstitions and things associated with it. And so I'd looked at things like that, and I'd looked at sort of different types of ways of using cards and things like that. And then it was Mark Norman, who runs the Folklore podcast, was connected with Cross Crow, the publisher, and they were like, oh, they're looking for folklore titles. Is that something you'd like to write about? And I was just like, divination, because it's a huge topic. And that was where I was kind of like, oh, I can put omens in there, and I can put this in there, and I can put that. And it just ended up spiraling. And it basically came from like an intrinsic interest I'd already had. And then I just had an excuse to do some more research on it. And not that I really need an excuse, but it's sort of on paper, it looks like I've got an excuse to do the research into it.
Sanctioned paid excuse to do it.
Exactly.
I like it. One of the things you came up with, and I hadn't thought of this question, was in there, was the difference between divination and fortune telling. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because I was sitting there going, is there a difference? And I was thinking, you kind of feel a little bit like divination's like this highbrow sort of, a bit like having an augur going out and taking the auspices, whereas fortune telling almost sounds a little bit, just from its name, a little bit more working class, shall we say. And I think that's not fair. And I think a lot of that is the associations that have become linked to it, because you would have fortune tellers that would probably be sort of travelling fortune tellers and things. And in this country, when I looked at the different versions of the Witchcraft Act that we'd had, they really were having to go at fortune tellers, not people doing divination. It's not easy to map. One was performed by women and one was performed by men, but you do start to see elements of that. And not that I'm blaming the patriarchy, but it is an interesting coincidence. But I think it was Sairi Janelle made the best distinction between them, I think, that I liked when I came across it. Collective cartomancy, and that was the idea that like divination gives you like a general, this is sort of the direction that you're going in if everything stays as it is right now, here are your options, whereas fortune telling is like, this is what's going to happen unless you change something. So fortune telling, you can sort of act on it a bit more immediately, whereas divination is kind of a little bit more like giving you a roadmap with several routes on it. And I think because I tend to use divination more in that sense rather than what is going to happen. So I think it's ultimately what you're trying to get out of it becomes the distinction rather than who practiced it and why, which I think is possibly a more helpful way, in my opinion, of looking at it.
Yeah, far more helpful. It popped into my head, just like the Romani people and the persecution of that entire culture of people. And it's probably wrapped up in that racism and genocide, if you will. Yeah. But I like that distinction of one's more absolute. This is what's going to happen if you go down this path, and the other's more options. It takes some of that old racism out of it. I love it. Thank you. Well, you added a lot of folklore to divination in this book, which I really, really enjoyed. How difficult is it for you to unravel where these practices started? Like, how do you even go down the road to figure out where all these divination practices started?
Yeah, because some of them are a bit random, like the one Tyromancy, which is the divination by cheese, which I must admit is an absolute favourite thing that I discovered, because I was like, what? Why would you waste cheese? No. And you just think, I have no idea who the first person was who tried that, because often you're like, it's difficult to find out who the first person was because it was at an accident, was it on purpose, things like that. And I think where it comes to things like the cartomancy is much more easy and much more straightforward because so many scholars have traced the history of tarot or playing cards or whatever it might be. So you can, and obviously with things like oracle cards, they actually do have a bit of a history far beyond the 20th century, but they were used as like fortune telling devices, and you can find loads of them for free online because they're all in the public domain now. So cards are quite straightforward, but things like weather omens, sometimes you can find them in old farmers' almanacs, and then you can kind of start to work out, well, how long has this been known? Has this been oral for a really long time and someone's now just written it down? And death omens, you tend to find those clustered in the 19th century. Personally, I think that's partly because the Victorians were massive goths, but I think it's also the fact
totally
that
were.
absolutely, and I think there's also a degree with them that was when they were collecting stuff. So you don't know how long these have been passed around, and this is part of the problem with folklore. If it's not written down, you only find out about it at the point that it is. But then you have other things like the wonderful I never know if it's diviners or diviners in ancient Mesopotamia, who like kept a clear record of all of the livers that they were sort of like cutting up and having a look at to take the auspices for their rulers. So they kept a record. Awesome. So we know when that happened because there's tangible physical evidence that's been found. So sometimes they're quite straightforward. Things like augury as well. The Romans obviously made a note of auspices. So sometimes they appear in the written record, but they tend to be the ones that were done for the king. No clue what ordinary people were doing at that time because it just wasn't written down. So sometimes you have to think this must have been done for long enough that people thought to tell it to someone, but where it came from is a lot more difficult. So unless you have something like the Seven Shears, which is the cunning person's way of sort of checking if someone was pregnant, or more often than not identifying thieves, that appears in court records. So at least you can go, well, that must go back to this particular time. But otherwise, yeah, you're like, who was cutting things into blocks of cheese? No idea.
I read bones. And so I've done some research on folklore of bone reading. And you talked about the scapulas and how many different cultures actually kept records of the divination on the scapula itself. I thought was really, really cool. I'd never seen that anywhere else.
Yeah, and I think with that one, it was fascinating to see that. I suppose it's such a big flat bone as well, and it's quite a recognisable one, let's be honest. And I'm assuming people aren't necessarily that familiar with bones, because why would most people know what they are? But I think with that one, it gives you a nice big flat surface. And I suppose because obviously the thing I liked about, I think it was were they in Alaska or Siberia, the people who were using it almost to create a map for where to go hunting, and then turning it round to sort of fit the geography of where they were as well. I love the way that they were sort of bringing the divination into their environment rather than it being this kind of esoteric, well, this is what the gods say. It became, no, this is what we need to do here and now. And I think that again shows the value of divination on like an everyday basis.
Yeah, like they were just bringing it. It feels like a really great way to be one with the world around you, and things that we're all trying to get back to now, they were just doing in their daily life. I also liked how they would put it in the fire and then see where the crackles happened inside of the bone. And then that was a map itself to tell them where to go or not go. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting when that anthropologist was saying how it was also a way of then connecting sympathetically with the animal it came from. And I think, like you're saying, that sort of sense of animism, how much we need that now.
So much, so very much. Well, do you use animism in your practice, or what? Tell us a little bit about what your practice looks like.
I think I do. I mean, I didn't really realise, this is going to sound really bad, but I didn't really realise what animism was until a few years ago. Like, I hadn't realised that was what that worldview was called, because it doesn't really get a huge amount of airtime. And I think when you come into sort of paganism, it's like, oh, which gods do you work with? Which pantheon do you work with? And it's like, well, what about this other class of spirits who are all around you all the time? And I think when you actually look back at obviously much older sort of cultures. Obviously we don't know what the Bronze Age and the Iron Age were doing because they didn't write it down, but there is some evidence, for example, at a site called Star Car in Yorkshire, of a degree of trying to engage with the natural environment via connecting with the animals in it. So you think this is a way of seeing the world that has existed probably as long as there's been people. And it was people like Amaya Rourke and Althea Sebastiani and Sarah Corbett whose work I would sort of look at and go, okay, so animism is sort of getting to know the spirits of everything that is around you. And obviously some of them won't want anything to do with you, the same as some people won't, but treating them as part of your community. And I think that that's, again, something that we've all been missing for such a long time, is that sense of feeling that you belong to something. So I think in some ways it does then interact with how you go about it. I mean, even at a ridiculous level, like I do actually thank the printer photocopier at work, and it always works for me, because I will like give it a little pat and I'll be like, good job, and things like that. Because you think, they essentially plastic, if you trace it back far enough, was at one point living organisms to then produce oil to then become plastic. And obviously metal is a natural thing. So I think, why wouldn't there be a ghost in the machine, quite literally, in that case? So yeah, I think it does kind of bleed into how I then relate to trees and plants in particular, because it's really easy, I think, to connect with sort of animals in a way, because you can see them as individuals, because they are. Whereas with things like moss, for example, is that one giant piece of moss, or is it lots of individual ones growing next to each other? So you've got to have a different mindset, I think. And you feel awful when you've got to put a spider outside or something like that, because you're like, oh no, I'm not, what's the word, connecting with this particular neighbour very well, but I also can't have that massive spider in my house, so it will go outside. So I think it does impact how I try to live my day, as it were.
You've said it a few times, and I really like the correlation of neighbors, and they're part of your community. I think if we spent a little bit more time thinking that way, one, we would feel a lot less alone. And two, like we would be more in sync with nature and the world around us. Well, is like one of the things, because you've done so much history and folklore, like if you could sit down with any historical storyteller or folklorist, who would that be and why?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I suppose there's a folklorist who collected a lot of stuff. He appears in the book quite a lot, called William Henderson, and he specialised in sort of folklore and the legends and whatnot of sort of the northern part of Britain. And he was from, I think it was County Durham, and he published his first book in 1879, and it's absolutely like a go-to book for anyone who's interested in sort of like northern folklore. And what I love when you read the introduction is he makes it very clear that his motivation was, he just was really enthusiastic about folklore. And rather than it sort of being this distant like vicar going around trying to find something to do, he'll add his own commentary on stuff. So like when he's talking about magpie rhymes, he sort of adds a recollection he's got of a woman actually abiding by magpie rhymes when he was younger, and he will just kind of interject with his own experience of these, because he just seems genuinely enthusiastic about it. And you don't really have that sort of almost distinction of a detached observer. This is someone who's in the trenches with the people practicing folklore and sharing it orally, and he then just happens to write it down. So yeah, I'd love to sit down with him and be like, mate, what got you started?
Give me the deets.
Yeah.
If someone is kind of in their region and wanting to connect with the region and the culture and the folklore of their region, what's a good place for them to start?
I think if you are in Europe, I would say have a look and see if you've got a local folklore society. Have a look in your local library. Libraries are hugely underrated, and I think it's the idea of books being free is like to access is probably one of the few things you can point to and go, the Victorians had a really good idea there. And I think obviously the internet is brilliant. Google Books has got plenty of texts on it, and you can obviously just search by your area with Internet Archive. Obviously, if you're in the States or Canada or Australia or somewhere like that, then learning who lived there first, are they still there, that kind of thing. And obviously recognizing that they are the original sort of stewards of the land would be good. But like, you can obviously also still connect, I think, with the point one settling happens. Well, what was the folklore that was brought there? Because then you end up with this really interesting mixture where the different diasporas kind of create something new. So you can always connect with that if you want. And there'll still be records of that and people will have collected it for the same reasons that they did in Europe. So I think that would be the two ways of looking at it. But I would say if you at least know whose land you're on, I think it becomes easier to then connect with it from that point of view.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you brought up libraries and librarians. I think, when I was growing up, the librarian was like a god or goddess, as the case may be. And I went to them for everything. And as an adult now, because we have Google, we have all these search engines, I tend to forget that the librarians are there. And when you show up with something like this, to be like, this is what I'm researching and this is where I want to go, they are giddy to get to research something different that they don't normally get to follow the threads of.
Yeah,
So
and I
don't
think
forget.
librarians are massively underrated. And I think it's been really interesting seeing the memes that have been coming out about, obviously, the late and great Anthony Head, who I think is probably one of the more famous librarians of them all. And obviously, I think so many of us who grew up with them is kind of making librarians cool. I can't promise that they're all going to be Giles, but, go and speak to them, because they will know what... and also, they'll know what they've got which isn't on display. Because I always forget this, like our city library has the stacks, which is like this shadowy bit of the library that you can't go in, and they've got stuff that you can't access, and it's like, what's back there? And if you ever see videos of like behind the scenes at the British Library, and there's just mile after mile after mile of racks, and you're like, there could be all sorts of treasures hidden there. And so I think, yeah, even just thinking about it from that point of view, like they're going to know where the good stuff is.
Yeah, they know where the good stuff is. And they're also trained researchers. Like that's their training. What about, is there one of your past books that you've written that you feel like maybe people haven't discovered yet and you wanted to talk about?
I think the other one was, I did write a book specifically about love magic and love divination that came out in January. And that one was a funny one, because then it's like, oh, now I have to think about ethics. I can't just go, here's all this cool stuff. So one of the cool things about love divination is most of them are, am I going to get married, or can I have a vision of who I'm going to marry? There's none of this compulsion stuff in there. And some of them are aimed at men, but most of them are aimed at women. And I feel like any gender can really use them if you look at the basics of how they work. But then we look at the love magic and it's like, oh man, I'm going to have to put the nasty stuff in here, but just not include instructions as to how to do it. And it was amazing how much of the compulsion magic was being sometimes done on a person's behalf by an actual magician. And it was nearly always a man hiring one to compel a woman to sleep with him. And you're like,
Shocking.
the more things change, the more they stay the same. But then obviously with that one, it was interesting sort of splitting it again into sections, like how did people use plants? How did people use puppets in all the different formats? And again, it was funny because I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be like all really lovely. And then, oh wow, there's some really dark stuff in here. So it was a bit of a funny one, because it was like, I don't want to pretend this stuff didn't happen, but I don't want people to go and do it. So how do I walk that middle line of, here's the information, but that's all you get?
Yeah, I picked up an old spell book that had a lot of love magic in it, and it was old medieval love magic, a lot of necromantic love magic. I'm like, this is awful. I better hide this in the back of the bookshelf so nobody looks at it.
Yeah. So some of them are quite bad, and you do look at them, and when they're getting spirits and they're like, I'm going to compel a spirit to then do. You imagine the spirit going, oh God, again. Like, why can't I have something interesting to do?
Well, as a bone reader, it's questions I get a lot is about love. Like, is this person going to come back to me? Am I ever going to find love? Where am I going to find love? It's definitely a much needed topic. So go check out Icy's book. See what you can find out on your own. Well, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners before we wrap up our episode and conversation?
No, I think we've covered everything. And I like the fact we have gone off on tangents, and I really like the fact one of those tangents was, aren't libraries cool? I think that's like, my work here is done, if that's the only thing
Right.
that you want to take away from it.
Like, that's the note to end on right there. Librarians are awesome. Libraries are cool. Go check it out. Where do people find you, Icy, if they want to follow you, find your books, find your work, find your podcast?
I think everything kind of tentacles out. That makes me sound like Cthulhu, but it all comes from my website, which is icysedgwick.com. And I'm on X, but I don't really use it. I'm just kind of camping to keep my username. I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram, though, both as Icy Sedgwick. And for my podcast, like literally every platform, including YouTube, if you just look for Fabulous Folklore, it'll come up. And there's almost 7.5 years worth of content on there. So you're bound to find an episode about something you're interested in.
Yeah, it was fun to go skip around through it. I was like, oh, there's so much here. How did I not know this podcast existed? So thank you. I know what I'm doing the rest of the summer. Laying out in the deck with a glass of wine and Fabulous Folklore. It was wonderful to meet you, Icy, and connect with you and chat with you. Thanks for coming on Witching Out Loud, and let's all go do witchy shit.
Thanks for listening to Witching Out Loud. You can find us at Witching Out Loud on Substack, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow us for highlights and reminders. Subscribe for witchy tips, seasonal celebrations, and extended show notes. If you love our show and want to support us further, there's an option to support us monetarily on Substack, as well as sponsorships and advertising opportunities. So please share with us how you are witching out loud. Now go do witchy shit.